When you think of Apple, two names immediately come to mind: Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, the visionary and the technical genius, the showman and the engineer. Together, they created one of the most valuable companies in human history, a company worth over $3 trillion today. But what if I told you there was a third person, a third co-founder who sat at that table on April 1st, 1976, when Apple Computer Company was born? His name is Ronald Wayne, and 12 days after signing the partnership agreement that created Apple, he walked away. He sold his 10% stake in the company for $800. Today, that same stake would be worth somewhere between $75 and $94 billion. That's billion with a B. It would make him one of the wealthiest people on the planet, richer than most nations. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. Ronald Wayne doesn't regret his decision, not one bit. In fact, he's been remarkably consistent about this over the past nearly 50 years. And the more you learn about who he was, what he faced, and the world he lived in, the more his choice starts to make a different kind of sense. This is a story about risk and wisdom, about youth and experience, and about a moment in time that would define an industry, and about the road not taken. It's a story that I think resonates particularly with those of us who've lived through decades of change, who understand that life's most important decisions aren't always about money, and who know that sometimes walking away takes more courage than staying. So let me take you back to 1976, to a very different America, to a garage in Los Altos, California, and to the moment when Ronald Wayne made a decision that would fascinate people for generations. Chapter 2. Who was Ronald Wayne? To understand Ronald Wayne's decision, you first have to understand who he was. Because unlike the two young men he partnered with, Wayne wasn't a kid chasing a dream. He was a 41-year-old man who had already lived quite a life. Ronald Gerald Wayne was born on May 17, 1934, in Cleveland, Ohio. Think about that year for a moment. 1934, the Great Depression was still gripping America. Franklin Roosevelt was president. The world was a very different place. Wayne trained as a technical draftsman at the School of Industrial Art High School in New York City. This was a young man who understood precision, who could visualize complex systems, who had the patience and attention to detail that engineering demands. These were skills that would serve him well throughout his life. By the mid-1970s, Wayne had made his way to California, that promised land that so many Americans migrated to in search of opportunity. He found work in the burgeoning electronics industry. And here's where his story takes an interesting turn. He decided to become an entrepreneur. In 1971, Wayne started his first business, a company selling slot machines. Now, for those of us who remember the 70s, you'll recall that Nevada was the only state where casino gambling was legal. It was a very specific, very competitive market. And Wayne's business failed. This wasn't just a minor setback. Wayne later described the failure of his slot machine business as very traumatic and spent 1 year repaying the debts. Imagine working for an entire year just to dig yourself out of a hole, every paycheck going to pay off creditors, every day a reminder of failure. He reflected years later that he had discovered something important about himself. He had no business being in business. He was, he said, far better working in engineering. This is crucial to understanding what comes next, because by 1976, Ronald Wayne was not a starry-eyed optimist about entrepreneurship. He was a cautious man who had learned painful lessons. But he was also highly respected in his field. In 1976, Wayne worked at Atari, where he was well regarded for his sophisticated and comprehensive
internal corporate documentation systems. Atari, for those who remember, was the hottest company in Silicon Valley at the time. They made Pong and other video games. They were revolutionary. And Wayne was part of that world. It was at Atari that he met two younger colleagues, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Jobs was 21, Wozniak was 25, and Wayne was 41. Nearly twice their age, old enough to be their father.
Chapter 3. The Founding. Now, here's where our story really begins. Jobs and Wozniak would have typically intense discussions about computer design and the future of the industry. To mediate one of these discussions, Wayne invited the pair to his home. Picture this scene: Wayne's modest California home. Two brilliant but volatile young men arguing about technology, about possibilities, about dreams. And Wayne, the elder statesman, the mediator, the voice of reason, trying to help them find common ground. In the ensuing 2-hour conversation about technology and business, Jobs proposed founding a computer company led by Wozniak and himself. But here's the twist: they needed Wayne. Why? Because Jobs and Wozniak were brilliant, but they were also notorious for butting heads. They needed someone who could break ties, who could bring adult supervision to the venture. The two Steves would each hold a 45% stake, while Wayne would receive a 10% stake to act as a tiebreaker in their decisions. As the venture's self-described adult in the room at age 41, Wayne drafted the original partnership agreement. Right there, that evening, he sat down and typed it up. And on April 1st, 1976, April Fool's Day, appropriately enough, the three men founded Apple Computer Company. But Wayne's contributions went far beyond just being a mediator. Wayne created the first Apple logo, known as Apple Newton, which showed an image of Isaac Newton reading a book under a tree, capturing the moment right before an apple fell on his head. It was an elaborate illustration, with a quote from the poet William Wordsworth wrapped around the border. The quote read, "Newton, a mind forever voyaging through strange seas of thought, alone." It's quite poetic, isn't it? It spoke to discovery, to knowledge, to that moment of revelation that changes everything. And Wayne wrote the Apple I operations manual, providing initial consumers with detailed instructions needed for assembly and operation of this new home computing appliance. Remember, in 1976, there was no such thing as a personal computer as we know it today. People didn't understand what these devices were for or how to use them. Wayne's manual was essential. He created detailed circuit drawings that enabled mass production of motherboards. Without these technical documents, Apple couldn't have scaled production. This was serious, important work that required Wayne's years of experience and meticulous attention to detail. For those brief days, it must have felt exciting. 3 partners working together, building something new. Wayne was doing what he did best, creating systems, documenting processes, bringing order to chaos. But something was deeply troubling him.
Chapter 4. The Decision. Now we come to the heart of our story, the decision. And to understand it, you need to understand several things that were happening simultaneously. First, there was the matter of personality. Wayne later described Wozniak as the most gracious man I've ever met in my life, with a personality that was contagious. But Jobs? That was different. Wayne found Jobs much tougher to deal with, describing him as a very focused fellow, and warning that you never wanted to be between him and where he wanted to go, or you'd find footprints on your forehead. He even said that, famously, if you had your choice between Steve Jobs and an ice cube, you'd nuzzle up to the ice cube for warmth. Now, Wayne acknowledged that Jobs' intensity was what it took to turn Apple into what it became. But he also recognized that working with Jobs day in and day out would be exhausting.
Jobs and Wozniak were whirlwinds, obsessed with pushing boundaries, and he felt it was like having a tiger by the tail. But personality wasn't the real issue. The real issue was risk, specifically financial risk. Apple got its first major order, 50 computers from a small company called the Byte Shop. This sounds great, right? Their first big sale. But there was a problem. Jobs had to secure a $15,000 line of credit to purchase materials needed to fulfill the order, and the Byte Shop had a reputation as a notoriously slow-paying vendor. $15,000 in 1976 is equivalent to about $70,000 today, and there were doubts about whether the Byte Shop would actually pay the invoice. Now here's the critical legal point that younger people today might not fully appreciate. All members of a partnership are personally responsible for any debts incurred by any partner. Let me repeat that because it's absolutely crucial. In a partnership, you are personally liable for debts. Not just the company's debts, your partner's debts become your debts. Unlike Jobs and Wozniak, who were 21 and 25 and had little to lose, Wayne had already acquired a sizable amount of personal assets that potential creditors could possibly seize. Wayne owned a house, a car, and savings, all at risk if Apple failed. Think about this from Wayne's perspective. He was 41 years old. He had spent a year of his life paying off debts from his failed slot machine business. He had finally gotten back on his feet, finally had some security, and now he was being asked to risk it all on a venture run by two brilliant but volatile 20-somethings, one of whom was notoriously difficult to work with. Wayne's attitude concerning business was already risk-averse following his experience 5 years prior with the very traumatic failure of the slot machine business. There was also another factor, one that's more personal. Wayne's passion was in original product engineering and in slot machines, not in the documentation systems Jobs and Wozniak expected him to manage, possibly indefinitely at Apple. He could see the future stretching ahead of him, years in a back office, managing paperwork, mediating disputes, while his heart was elsewhere. Wayne believed he was standing in the shadow of giants of product design and was eager to shield himself from financial exposure. And so, 12 days after creating the document that formally created Apple, Ronald Wayne made his choice. He returned to the county registrar's office and filed an amendment, formally withdrawing his name and involvement in the company. Wayne was paid $800 in exchange for relinquishing his equity stake. A year later, he accepted an additional payment of $1,500 to forfeit any potential future claims against the newly incorporated company. Total payout? $2,300 for a 10% stake in what would become one of the most valuable companies in human history.
Chapter 5. The Aftermath. So what happened next? How did Ronald Wayne's life unfold after walking away from Apple? The simple answer is, he went on with his life. Shortly after leaving Apple, Wayne resisted Jobs' attempts to get him to return, remaining at Atari until 1978. He then worked at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and later at Thor Electronics in Salinas, California. He operated a stamp shop for a while. He pursued his interests in coins and rare collectibles. He moved to Nevada. He lived a quiet life, far from the spotlight that would eventually consume Silicon Valley. And what of Apple? Well, we all know that story. The company went public in December 1980, making both Jobs and Wozniak instant millionaires. The Macintosh revolutionized personal computing in 1984. The iPod transformed music in 2001. The iPhone changed everything in 2007. And today, Apple is the most valuable company in the world. By any financial calculation, Ronald Wayne made what appears to be one of the worst business decisions in history.
With Apple's current market capitalization, Wayne's stake would be worth approximately $75 billion. Even accounting for the natural dilution of shares over time, we're still talking about tens of billions of dollars. To put this in perspective, if Wayne had held on to his shares, he would be wealthier than most nations. He could buy and sell companies. He could influence global events. His wealth would be almost incomprehensible. Instead, Wayne retired to a mobile home park in Pahrump, Nevada, where he sells stamps and rare collectibles. The contrast couldn't be more stark. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where I think those of us with some years and experience can appreciate something the younger generation might miss. When asked about his decision, Wayne has consistently said, "I've never regretted my decision for one moment." And he's explained why. He said, "If I had stayed with them through the Apple Corporation phase, I probably would have ended up the richest man in the cemetery." Think about what he's saying. He's not talking about money. He's talking about stress, about lifestyle, about what it would have cost him personally to ride that roller coaster. Wayne told an interviewer, "If I had stayed with Apple, I probably would have wound up the richest man in the cemetery. They were whirlwinds. It was like having a tiger by the tail."
Chapter 6: Wisdom and Perspective. So what do we make of Ronald Wayne's story? What lessons can we draw from this remarkable tale? I think the first lesson is this: hindsight bias is real and it's powerful. Looking back, it's easy to think we would have known Apple would succeed. After all, Apple had Steve Jobs. But in 1976, Jobs wasn't Steve Jobs. He was just another guy with a dream. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of computer startups in the 1970s. Most of them failed. Most of them are completely forgotten. The idea that personal computers would become ubiquitous? That wasn't obvious at all. Many serious business people thought personal computers were toys with no real market. Wayne made his decision based on the information he had at the time, his own circumstances, and his own priorities. And by those measures, Wayne made the right decision and decades later still feels that way. The second lesson is about success itself. We live in a culture that measures success almost entirely in financial terms. But is that the only measure that matters? Wayne lived a life doing what he enjoyed: engineering, collecting, pursuing his interests. He didn't have ulcers or heart attacks from stress. He didn't spend decades in boardrooms and courtrooms. He lived life on his own terms. There's something to be said for peace of mind. Wayne valued stability over Silicon Valley chaos. And let's be honest, being part of a startup, especially one as tumultuous as early Apple, is exhausting. Not everyone is built for that, and not everyone should have to be. The third lesson is perhaps the most important. We all make decisions based on incomplete information. Every single day, we make choices without knowing how they'll turn out. Sometimes we get lucky, sometimes we don't. But the quality of a decision isn't determined solely by its outcome. It's determined by whether it was reasonable given what we knew at the time. Wayne had legitimate reasons for his concerns. The bike shop deal was risky. Jobs was difficult. Wayne had debts he was still recovering from. He valued his financial security. These weren't irrational fears. They were prudent concerns from an experienced business person. You know, there's an interesting footnote to this story. In the early 1990s, Wayne sold the original Apple partnership contract paper, signed in 1976 by Jobs, Wozniak, and himself, for $500. In 2011, that document was sold at auction for $1.6 million. Wayne later admitted he wished he'd hung on to that document longer. That's his one regret. Not selling his Apple shares, but selling that historical document too cheaply. It tells you something about his priorities. So when you look at your iPhone or your iPad or your Mac, remember Ronald Wayne. Remember the man who sat at that table in 1976, who helped create the company, who designed that first logo with Newton under the apple tree, who wrote that first manual. Remember the man who walked away. And remember that his story isn't really about regret. It's about choices and consequences and finding peace with the path you've chosen. Before the bitten apple, there was Newton under a tree, and the man who drew it, then walked away. Sometimes the road not taken isn't a mistake. Sometimes it's just a different journey. And sometimes, just sometimes, wisdom means knowing when to walk away. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Ronald Wayne's position? I genuinely love to hear your perspective. Until next time, remember, life's most important decisions aren't always about money. Sometimes they're about knowing yourself well enough to choose the path that's right for you.